and get this started. Part 2, Nixon. If you'll review with me from the first video, one of the things we talked about, of course, Republican Richard Nixon goes up for election in 1968 for the second time, but this time he wins. He'll be in office from 68 to 73. He is a Republican. We talked about the election of 1968. If you're reviewing with me on your notes, that's exactly what I want you to do. He went up against a Democrat, Hubert Humphrey, and also an independent, George Wallace. He won because he appealed to the silent majority, the people who were fed up with how this country was going in Vietnam and also the hippie culture. But in all reality, Richard Nixon becomes president. Actually, his shining moment is not anything to do with his election or even his domestic policies. And of course, he'll be scarred by Watergate, and you'll know exactly what we're talking about after a next video. But his actually shining moment is foreign policy, the search of detente, if you will. Now, with that, he is going to end the Vietnam War. He doesn't exactly do it perfectly, though. He says, I want to give you peace with honor. I hope he said that, peace with honor. I also want to make sure that we turn over this war that should have probably been fought by the South Vietnamese to the South Vietnamese gradually and train them on how to fight their own war. It's Vietnamization, okay? But in all reality, he's also looking towards this idea of detente. Now, he will hit a little bit of a snag when he, of course, launches the secret war on Cambodia and Laos without Congress's approval, and he gets the War Powers Act passed on him in the 1970s. But with that, the fall of Saigon, the fall of Vietnam, the unbelievably harsh legacy that it will leave is going to really kind of hurt Nixon. So he's going to try and take and search for that detente. Now, with that, I do have at the very end of your foreign policy notes, down at the very bottom, I have this part that says just China, dash. Well, here's what we are going to be looking at. Now, if you'll notice, I'm kind of putting a lot of stuff in red that I think is important. Nixon becomes the first U.S. president to visit and recognize the People's Republic of China. Literally, the first American president to visit the PRC under Mao Zedong, which is unbelievably significant. You have an American Democratic president visiting Mao's communist China. Now, a lot of people are going to be like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that this is happening. But remember, Nixon's goal of detente, say it, detente. And remember, what does detente mean? The relaxing of Cold War relations. Say it, the relaxing of Cold War relations. He wants to actually not be friends, not like, ooh, let's sing Kumbaya and give each other a hug. But he says, we're on the same planet as these people. We need to coexist. We might even want to make a little trade with them, make some money. So he goes and he visits China. These improved Sino-American relations help ease the Cold War tensions, and I'm also going to be a little bit honest with you. Nixon does something called triangular kind of policy making, foreign policy wise. He figures if we cozy up to China, the USSR is going to probably get a little nervous. So also China, us being friends with China, forces the USSR to consider diplomacy, because if we're friends with China, remember, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. They don't want to get teamed up on. So the USSR might be a little bit more likely to talk to us. It also is interesting to note that this is going to be the first time we have economic access to China since really the open door policy was ended with, that aggression in the early 1900s. Now, with that, I have some pictures for you. I think these pictures are kind of cool, so I'm going to take time to show them to you. This is actually one of the coolest stories of detente. Remember that detente, the relaxing of relations? In the 1970s, Nixon sent over the U.S. Olympic ping pong team to China to play ping pong with the Chinese, the communist Chinese. And this is a picture of one of the arenas. Mao Zedong welcomed our ping pong team, and they played ping pong. And I know that sounds stupid, but if we can play ping pong with these people, can we coexist with them, and do we improve our relationship? Absolutely. So it's actually called, and this is interesting, you might want to make a little note of this, little star, ping pong diplomacy is what it was called. Kind of interesting. You'll totally get what I'm saying when we watch Forrest Gump. Hint, hint. Here's a picture right here. Holy Toledo. A communist and Nixon shaking hands. Detente. There's a picture. Ooh, this is my favorite picture possibly. Nixon and his wife, Mrs. Nixon, they're visiting the Great Wall of China. But here's a little bit, and then here's them visiting Tiananmen Square. But do you notice something weird? Mrs. Nixon is wearing red. We've come a long way since McCarthy, haven't we? Now, here's the deal. In search of detente, We need to get something down about SALT. You see where I put it on your notes? SALT. Okay, so Nixon traveled to Moscow to meet with this new Soviet leader. His name is Brezhnev, okay? It's not going to be one of the most important ones, but he does play a little bit of a role in the fact that the U.S. agreed to sell the USSR $1 billion worth of grain. You can kind of put that next to SALT in the little parentheses. But with that agreement to sell, we also decide to pass this treaty called SALT, which is weird because that sounds like food. No, SALT stands for, are you ready to write it down? Strategic Arms Limitation Talks. The first Cold War nuclear arms treaty. But here's the deal. Henry Kissinger and Nixon negotiate this. Okay, they also negotiated an end to a war between Israel and Egypt, which is pretty significant. But I'm going to focus on SALT. But they focus on this idea of SALT, Strategic Arms Limitations. And what I want you to do, and I'm going to check for this in your notes, I want you to circle the word arms, and I want you to circle limitation. What are arms? Not on your body. They're weapons. Limitation? That means we're limiting our weapons. Think about that. Big picture. We are limiting our weapons. The Cold War has not been about limiting our weapons. It's been about increasing our weapons. It's been about my nuke is bigger than your nuke. No, I'm faster. No, I'm going to put my nukes in Turkey. No, I'm going to put my nukes in Cuba. It's crazy. Now, Nixon, through detente, say that word, detente, is talking about limiting arms. Are we starting to see the Cold War maybe possibly ending? Crazy. The SALT was about missiles being limited because here's the deal. If I have guns, I'm going to use them, right? Think about World War I. Militarism. Yes? You have guns, you'll use them. Nixon says, let's not have guns. There are also two more things you need to know about Nixon's foreign policy before we go to his domestics. And that is the fact that Nixon's covert operations, that means secret operations, despite his public detente, you do need to know a little bit behind the scenes. He did have the CIA fund leaders of brutal governments in Iran, South Africa, Philippines, and Nicaragua, which is kind of a little bit suspect. But again, the CIA does lots of stuff like this, and Nixon, big picture, knows that we can make up and kiss with the Soviets and the communists a little bit, but we also have to make sure that we have some of a handle on some of these brutal governments, especially in Iran. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in the coming chapters. But then also, this one's kind of a bad one. CIA assassinated Chilean President Salvador Allende. And that's going to come back. So know those two. I might ask you about it on their quiz. But with that, let's go ahead and flip our paper over. Did you hear me flip my paper over? And let's talk about domestic policy. The first thing I want to make sure we talk about is the fact that I have the word moderate there. A moderate. Are we clear? Moderate means not extreme. Okay? So with that, I do need to make sure you know is Nixon is a moderate who kept LBJ's Great Society in place. He did not dismantle that liberal Great Society. But I will tell you, and here's what I need you to make sure you write down under moderate, is he kept LBJ's Great Society. You're writing that down? Kept LBJ's Great Society. But then look what I have right here. He shifted responsibility of social problems to the state and local governments. Nixon says it shouldn't be the federal government that hands out welfare checks. It should be state and local. Shouldn't be the federal government who takes and gives people unemployment. It should be state and local. And the next thing I have is I have reshaped SCOTUS. You see where I have that right there? Here's what you need to make sure you know about that. Nixon is going to appoint 4 new justices on the Supreme Court of the United States. Now, this is one of his jobs as basically President of the United States, checks and balances. The President gets to pick who he nominates for the Supreme Court. Now, of course, the Senate has to approve that pick and that nomination, which is where that checks and balances, because the Senate could be like, no, we don't agree. And then Nixon has to pick somebody else. But here's the deal. When Nixon, a Republican, picks 4 new justices, there are 9 justices total. 9 justices total. He picks 4. Literally means that Nixon picks almost half of the Supreme Court justices. And that is massive because he's going to pick conservative ideologies like him, which means he reshapes the Supreme Court, which is kind of interesting to know because there's going to be a court case coming up called Roe versus Wade. It's actually going to be one of the most liberal court cases ever, but still, we'll get to that in a second. He did replace retiring Justice. I don't know if I'm necessarily going to ask you that, but I will say that William Rehnquist, who he appoints as on the Supreme Court, becomes one of the most conservative Supreme Court justices we have had in quite a while. Now, Roe versus Wade. I know I only gave you a little bit of room for this, but you better listen up because it's totally important. Roe versus Wade was a court case about, and this is going to be a touchy subject, I know, 100%, because of religious reasons, personal choices, etc., and we always want to respect everybody's rights and everybody's right to have a different opinion than us, but it is a court case about abortion. Now, here's what I want you to make sure you get this down. There is a woman in Texas who is going to attempt to obtain an abortion through legal means. Before 1973, and you want to make sure you have that year, 1973, abortion was denied and it was illegal. This woman in Texas, she had been raped, and I do believe that she did not want to have this child. It's a very not very well-known story because here's the deal. It says Roe versus Wade, but that was because she went by Jane Roe. Have you ever heard of a Jane Doe, a body that they don't know who they are? She went by Jane Roe because she didn't want her name to be used on the court case, which is pretty, obvious. She's trying to get an abortion. She's not very proud of that. So she goes and she tries to get this abortion. They are telling her she cannot because she had not been a victim of rape. I'm sorry, I may have said that she was. She had not been a victim of rape. It was by her own choosing that she became pregnant. She wanted to have an abortion. She then turns around and sues because here's the deal. When she went into the clinic, the guy asked, have you been a victim of rape or incest? And she said no. And then he said, well, I can't do it. And she sued saying when he asked me, he violated my right to privacy. There had been a previous court case. Here's a good quiz question for you, and you might want to make sure you write it down somewhere. Gideon versus Wainwright, who basically said that it's somebody's right to have privacy in medical cases, in medical situations. So what Jane Roe does is she uses that case and she takes and she builds upon it and says she has a right to privacy. He shouldn't have asked me that. Therefore, I should be able to have this abortion. She wins, and through Roe versus Wade, we now have a woman's right to choose or a right to refuse to have a child within the first trimester. If you take a look at this data right here, down here, it says, should abortion be legal? Yes, 54%. No, 44%. But take a look back at time. Okay, Roe versus Wade decision, should it be overturned? In 1989, 58%, okay, said that it should not be overturned. 60% it should not be. 70%. Literally, we are becoming a more liberal society, if you will, but definitely Roe versus Wade changes the ballgame completely. Yeah, I put Woodstock, enough said, 1969. You need to know what happened. Of course, counterculture, hippies, 3 days, peace, love, music, of course, Jimi Hendrix. If you haven't listened to the Star Spangled Banner by Hendrix, do yourself a favor and listen to it, America. Okay, now let's talk about a couple more things I have down here. I want to make sure we get this down. The EPA, Nixon oversaw the creation of the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, largely due to, and I'm pretty sure you know this, but you might want to make sure you notate, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, and of course we come up with Earth Day. The EPA also goes right along with the Endangered Species Act. The Endangered Species Act specifically went and protected habitats of animals and said we need to protect these animals and their habitats. But one thing I do want to make sure you understand is he did end the gold standard in 1971, and he put us on what we call a fiat money system where the government says how much money there will be, not I have a piece of gold that backs up this $10 bill in my hand. The bad thing about the economy, Nixon inherited inflation and a deficit because of the Vietnam War. We were in debt. The Americans were starting to go into a recession in the end of the 1960s, early 70s. You need to know that. So make sure we get that down. And also know that Nixon responded to this recession by freezing wages and prices and putting a 10% tax on imports. So pause this, get this all down under the economy. Pause. Okay, This is going to be called Nixonomics, last thing you need to know. And let's go ahead and start the next video. Nixonomics.